Welcome to another scary episode of Restless Killers and Mysteries with Roger Heilig, the podcast where we delve into the dark, twisted, and frequently weird worlds of history's most legendary villains and unsolved mysteries. I'm Roger Heilig, your host, and I'm here to take you through a maze of horror with a touch of charm and wit. Before we get into today's macabre story, let's give a little shout out to our wonderful sponsor for this episode, the amazing A.M. Wolf. If you're intrigued by the complexities of historical events, this book is a must-read. It's currently available on Amazon and Audible, so go check it out. Okay everyone, buckle up because today's topic is not for the faint of heart. We're heading inside the terrifying realm of Tsutomu Miyazaki, often known as the Human Dracula. I know what you're thinking, Dracula? Isn't that the character from a horror novel? Oh, I wish it was that simple. Tsutomu Miyazaki brought Dracula's stories to a terrifying new level, gaining his reputation through activities that astonished even the most experienced crime specialists. Consider this: Japan, late 1980s, a country experiencing economic growth while also dealing with societal change. Enter Tsutomu Miyazaki, a seemingly ordinary man whose spiral into depravity would lead him to commit acts worthy of nightmares. His acts, folks, were so heinous and weird that they cemented his name in the darkest pages of real crime annals. Over the course of this episode, we'll peel back the layers of Miyazaki's twisted brain, journey through his terrifying early life, and painstakingly investigate the horrible deeds that labeled him a monster. But do not be afraid. We'll do it all with a wink and a nod because, well, we have to maintain our sanity, right? So sit back, maybe turn on some extra lights, and let's go on this scary voyage together. After all, nothing beats a scary story to keep you on your toes. Thank you for accompanying me on this terrifying and fascinating journey. Let us begin with a look at the man behind the monster, Tsutomu Miyazaki. So, let us delve into the terrifying backstory of Tsutomu Miyazaki, ominously dubbed the Human Dracula. Now, I know what you're thinking, Dracula. Were there vampires in Japan? Well, not precisely, but the name will begin to make sense as we uncover his heinous story. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born August 21, 1962, in Itsukaichi, Tokyo. Itsukaichi isn't the busy core of Tokyo that many people assume. It's more of a peaceful suburb, where you'd expect nothing exceptional, let alone something horrible. But Miyazaki was anything but ordinary. He was born preterm, which resulted in a physical abnormality in his hands. His wrists were fused together, preventing him from rotating his hands upward. This marked the beginning of a difficult life for little Tsutomu. Miyazaki grew up in an unconventional family. His father ran a regional newspaper, so they weren't in financial trouble, but they did have their own set of problems. Tsutomu was mainly ignored by his parents, who were preoccupied with their own life. He was mostly raised by his grandfather, with whom he shared a close relationship. But this was also not idyllic. It was a subdued relationship formed of necessity rather than warmth and affection. Miyazaki's academic performance initially looked promising. He was a relatively good student in his early years, making it to Meiji University, one of Japan's most prestigious colleges. But something has changed. He failed to maintain his early academic excellence and grew increasingly introverted. He spent his time immersed in a world of horror movies and gory comic books, which, if you ask me, didn't do much for his mental health. Now, let's talk about the major reason he's garnered such a gruesome reputation in true crime literature: his heinous acts. Miyazaki's transformation from a quiet young guy into a terrible serial killer is very disturbing. Between 1988 and 1989, Miyazaki perpetrated a series of abductions, killings, and cannibalism that stunned the Japanese people. His victims were all young girls, aged 4 to 7 years old. To add an even darker twist, he would mutilate their bodies after death and do horrible actions, making it easy to understand why he was compared to Dracula. The term the Human Dracula did not stem solely from his awful crimes on the deceased. There was a media frenzy surrounding his arrest, with details of his crimes and fascination with horror and gore shaping a narrative that presented him as a modern-day vampire. The media like a good term, and this one, and the gruesome mental imagery it conjures, sticks. Miyazaki is a figure of great fascination in true crime circles for several reasons. His deeds are so cruel and mindless that they evoke both fear and intrigue. But there's also the psychological puzzle. Why did someone with a seemingly normal background and intelligence commit such heinous crimes? Was it his neglectful upbringing, his physical deformity, or a combination of these factors? To summarize, Tsutomu Miyazaki's story is about more than the unspeakable anguish he visited on his victims and their families. It's a sobering reminder of how complicated and terrible the human psyche can be, and how even the most ordinary people may hide unspeakable atrocities. He remains a figure of macabre fascination, a cautionary tale of what can go wrong when a slew of elements collide in the worst conceivable way. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born on August 21, 1962, in Itsukaichi, Tokyo, into a wealthy family thanks to their successful print business. Despite his relatively wealthy upbringing, Miyazaki's early life was marked by struggles and psychological distress. Miyazaki was always a curious and intelligent child. He was born prematurely and suffered from a physical abnormality in which his hand joints fused, preventing him from bending his wrists inward. Because of his deformities, he was bullied at school, forcing him to feel alienated and isolated. His youth became even more problematic due to family dynamics. Miyazaki's connection with his parents was particularly tense. His father was frequently absent, preoccupied with business, and his mother apparently paid him little care. Miyazaki's lack of emotional connection at home was exacerbated by the fact that he was raised primarily by his grandfather, the only family member with whom he felt connected. When his grandfather died, it was a watershed moment for Miyazaki, sinking him deeper into seclusion and misery. Miyazaki was devastated by his grandfather's death, which left a hole that he was unable to fill. Interestingly and disturbingly, Miyazaki claims to have eaten some of his grandfather's cremated remains, an act that later fueled his notorious nickname, the Human Dracula. Around this time, Miyazaki also developed an obsession with pornography, initially focusing on regular adult content before progressing to more extreme and violent material. This wouldn't be a passing phase. It would escalate into a full-fledged addiction that blurred the borders between dream and reality for him. Miyazaki was a psychologically unstable person. Later assessments revealed that he had many complex diseases, including schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder. The psychological evaluations depicted a man with severe emotional scars, an inability to form normal relationships, and an unsettling preoccupation with death and mutilation. Miyazaki's mental health difficulties remained untreated and neglected throughout his life. Nobody in his close group seemed to notice, or perhaps choose to ignore, the warning indications of his damaged psyche. This neglect fueled his perverted obsessions and dark fantasies, further isolating him from reality. By the time he reached maturity, Miyazaki had severe, untreated psychological disorders concealed under a quiet, unassuming exterior. Those who looked behind the surface could see his alarming behavior, but no interventions were made in time. What began as a troubled childhood marked by emotional neglect, social isolation, and untreated psychological disorders culminated in a figure known as the Human Dracula. However, while his later actions were undeniably heinous, examining his early life reveals a human being deeply affected by his environment, plagued by inner demons that would eventually consume him and shatter countless lives. So, as we look more into his horrible actions, keep in mind that Tsutomu Miyazaki was not born a monster. His story is a sobering reminder of the dangers of untreated mental health difficulties, as well as the significance of prompt and successful psychiatric help. Today we'll journey inside the dark and twisted world of Tsutomu Miyazaki, often known as the Human Dracula. It's a story that's as breathtaking as it is disturbing, so strap in. So, who was Tsutomu Miyazaki, and why did he get such a horrible nickname? To answer this, let's go back to the late 1980s in Japan. Miyazaki's reign of terror began in 1988 and continued until his apprehension in 1989. His atrocities targeted young, innocent females, and the specifics are not to be taken lightly. Between August 1988 and June 1989, Miyazaki abducted and murdered 4 girls aged 4 to 7. These horrible atrocities engulfed Japan in horror and disbelief. Out of respect for the victims and their families, I will make certain that we keep the details as clear and simple as possible when we debate this. His first victim was a 4-year-old girl. Miyazaki lured her into his car and drove her into the woods, where he performed the unimaginable. His method of operation involved strangulation, and after killing his victims, he desecrated their bodies in ways that earned him the nickname Human Dracula. He would leave the remains in barren regions, assuring that they would not be discovered immediately. Miyazaki's return to the crime scene was one of the most horrific aspects of his actions. He would return to the corpses and further mutilate them, sometimes bringing body parts home as twisted mementos. He also shot images as a way to relive his heinous crimes. His vicious streak did not stop there. He would mail painful artifacts such as bones or teeth to the victims' relatives, tormenting both them and police authorities. As these sad events transpired, the authorities were frustrated by a lack of conclusive evidence and Miyazaki's skill to evade detection. However, his fourth and final crime led to his arrest. In July 1989, when attempting to abduct another little girl from a park, 2 sisters spotted him. These witnesses' brave deeds brought Miyazaki's despotic binge to an end. Miyazaki escaped the scene, but was apprehended by police shortly afterward. Officers searched his vehicle and discovered a variety of incriminating items, including photographs and video recordings of his victims. The evidence was strong and resulted in his immediate arrest. Miyazaki's demeanor following his incarceration adds to the bizarre nature of the event. He made no apologies, instead portraying himself as an anime character living out a macabre fantasy. His attitude appeared to indicate an alarming connection with reality, a psychological profile that baffled investigators and doctors alike. As the truth about his actions became known, Japan was shaken to its core. Tsutomu Miyazaki became one of Japan's most notorious criminals due to the savagery of his deeds and the psychological games he performed. In conclusion, his capture provided some relief to the terror-stricken families and an entire nation, but it also opened a Pandora's box of concerns about the human psychology, societal pressures, and the darkest side of human nature. We've covered a lot, but this is only the beginning of our journey to comprehend Tsutomu Miyazaki's ideas and motives. It's a difficult issue, but by confronting these harsh realities, we can develop a better knowledge of the elements that contribute to such deviant behavior, and ideally, how to prevent it in the future. The trial of Tsutomu Miyazaki was nothing short of a spectacle that captivated the entire country of Japan. Consider this, a courtroom surrounded by tremendous scrutiny, not only from the media but also from a populace anxious for justice and answers. What drove this seemingly regular man to execute such horrific acts? Miyazaki's trial began in 1990 and continued for several years, uncovering terrifying information that shocked the entire country. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Aside from physical evidence immediately linking him to the killings, such as DNA samples and victims' personal goods discovered in his home, there were also incriminating comments and confessions. But it wasn't only about the physical evidence. Psychological assessments played an important role in the courtroom drama. The prosecution portrayed a terrible image, offering significant forensic evidence and expert testimony to prove Miyazaki's guilt. His heinous actions earned him the appellation the Human Dracula, which frightened and captivated the populace in equal measure. Graphic images, forensic discoveries, and comprehensive narratives of his horrible deeds were all presented to the court, making an indelible impression on everyone there. On the other hand, Miyazaki's defense had a difficult task ahead of them. They said he had major mental health concerns, portraying him as a deluded guy removed from reality. They brought in psychiatrists who diagnosed him with multiple personality disorder, attempting to persuade the jury that he was not to blame for his acts due to his fragmented mental state. They relied primarily on the fact that Miyazaki had had an extremely rough childhood, riddled with abuse and neglect, which could have contributed to his deteriorating mental health. Despite these attempts, the court refused to be influenced. His manner throughout the trial was disturbing. He remained generally disinterested, at times eerily serene, escalating the public's outrage and confusion. His defense could not overcome the sad reality of his deliberate acts and the anguish he caused to his victims and their families. The decision came quickly and decisively. Tsutomu Miyazaki was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to die in 1997. His cool reaction to the verdict raised numerous doubts among many who followed the case, including whether he understood the gravity of his acts. Or was he actually a man trapped in the darkness of his own mind? His misdeeds had far-reaching consequences for society. Parents got more involved in their children's lives, schools established tougher safety measures, and communities grew increasingly attentive. The country also wrestled with the significance of mental health awareness and the limitations of psychiatric evaluations in the criminal justice system. Miyazaki's case became a watershed moment in debates over how society should treat mentally ill criminals. While some advocated for improved mental health care, others believed that no amount of psychological pain could justify such frightening behavior. Tsutomu Miyazaki was finally killed by hanging in 2008. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in Japan's criminal history, but the scars left behind serve as chilling reminders of the Human Dracula's actions. His case is still a focal point of true crime discussions, a morbid example of where the mind can go when left unchecked, and a societal mirror reflecting the complexities of human behavior in the justice system. Tsutomu Miyazaki's actions sent shockwaves throughout Japan, and the public's reaction was one of amazement and despair. Miyazaki's acts, which earned him the nickname the Human Dracula, were grisly enough to pique the nation's, if not the world's, dark curiosity. It is not every day that you come across such wickedness that it calls into question the entire foundation of cultural norms and legal frameworks. First and foremost, the public's immediate reaction was one of panic. Families began to impose tougher restraints on their children, and public belief in society's safety was severely damaged. Parents who earlier let their children roam their neighborhoods freely become overly cautious. The belief that it could never happen here was replaced with the terrible thought that it could happen anywhere. The media, of course, had a field day, or rather, several field years. Sensationalized accounts about Miyazaki's life and crimes appeared on television and in publications. His trial, in particular, received extensive coverage, elevating him to the status of macabre celebrity. It's worth observing how the media depicted not only a figure of terror, but also one of morbid interest. Tsutomu Miyazaki's name became linked with the worst human possibilities, making him Japan's own boogeyman. Now, let's discuss developments in law enforcement and legal practices. Prior to Miyazaki, Japan had a certain kind of innocence, believing that such horrible murders were a Western affliction. However, the notion that heinous criminal minds may be homegrown prompted important adjustments. Law enforcement organizations were forced to use more rigorous investigative tactics, including psychological profiling, which had previously been underutilized in the country. Legally, the case sparked a significant discussion regarding capital penalty, mental illness, and the legal system's ability to deal with such psychopathic behavior. Miyazaki was diagnosed with a mental condition, but the savagery of his conduct sparked widespread popular support for the death penalty. This case was crucial in reaffirming Japan's stance on capital punishment, emphasizing its necessity in extreme circumstances. In terms of society, Miyazaki's existence prompted Japan to focus more deeply on mental health issues. The instance underlined the critical need for improved mental health infrastructure and increased public understanding of psychological diseases. Schools began incorporating mental health education into their curricula, with the goal of not only identifying indicators of mental distress early on, but also destigmatizing the debate surrounding it. Furthermore, the case had an indelible impact on Japanese popular culture. From horror films to literature, Miyazaki's horrific actions prompted artists to delve into the psyche of such characters, contributing to a darker yet more contemplative strain of storytelling. Finally, Miyazaki's legacy is a complex mix of dread, reform, and introspection. It required a country to face its vulnerabilities and adjust. While it is critical to mourn the victims and their families, it is equally necessary to recognize the societal changes brought about by those tragic events. In short, Tsutomu Miyazaki was a solitary figure of evil, yet the consequences of his deeds resulted in a stronger, more self-aware society, resolved never to allow such tragedy to go unchecked again. When unraveling the dark tapestry weaved by Tsutomu Miyazaki, it's almost tempting to dismiss him as an anomaly, an outlier in criminal history. However, doing so would be to skim the surface and overlook the rich and undeniably morbid complexities that make his case as much a commentary on society as it is an investigation of one man's twisted psyche. So, let's participate in some armchair psychology. First and foremost, the term Human Dracula sounds almost like a campy horror movie title, and while it has an unmistakable edge, it simplifies a man who is far from simple. Miyazaki's acts were motivated by deeply ingrained psychological difficulties, and categorizing them simplistically does a disservice to comprehending the larger context. What drives someone to become a nightmare incarnate? Is it nature, nurture, or a toxic combination of the two? Miyazaki was born prematurely with physical defects in his hands, which led to lifelong bullying. Add to it a toxic familial environment and his father's eventual suicide, and you have some of the basic components for this dark psychological formula. We cannot ignore these factors. Of course, Miyazaki was also a social misfit, seeking consolation in horror films and pornographic manga, which, although not intrinsically harmful, hinted at deeper difficulties. The human component here is both perplexing and intriguing. We're not simply talking about the victims, whose awful deaths should never be overlooked. Imagine being a parent or sibling and witnessing such a monster emerge from within your family. What type of storm rages in the thoughts of people close to Miyazaki when they learn they've been living with someone capable of such actions? Did they ever catch a peek of the darkness within him, or was he so good at concealing it that his actions came as a surprise? More broadly, Miyazaki's example prompts us to raise some uncomfortable issues. How does society handle such individuals? Japan, for example, had to address its own structural difficulties, such as how mental health and severe criminal conduct are addressed and understood within cultural contexts. Does how we treat outcasts and the marginalized influence the development of people like Miyazaki, or is that an oversimplified view? And let us not forget the trial. While Miyazaki's heinous deeds were denounced, his argument of insanity spurred debate over whether psychological instability crosses the line into culpable evil. Should someone with obvious mental health concerns undergo the same legal procedures as others, or should there be a distinct standard? By providing the charm and casual wit we're looking for, here's a gentle reminder. How would you react if you encountered someone like Miyazaki in your community? Would you support humane studies and rehabilitation efforts? Or are there some signs of malevolence that we, as a community, are simply not prepared to deal with until it is too late? Such considerations place us on the verge of moral and ethical difficulty. Though we may never fully comprehend the maze that was Tsutomu Miyazaki's mind, these reflections can help us better appreciate the vulnerability of the human condition. As you chew on those concepts, consider the fine line that separates rationality from insanity, and good from evil. Remember, the world is both intriguing and terrifying, and it sometimes takes a monstrous mirror like Miyazaki to expose the flaws in our societal veneer. Until next time, remain curious, questioning, and peeling back the layers of the human soul. And so concludes today's unsettling journey into the macabre world of Tsutomu Miyazaki, the infamous Human Dracula. I hope you found this exploration as intriguing, and let's face it, unsettling, as I did. Tsutomu Miyazaki's narrative remains a chilling episode in true crime history, provoking and disturbing in equal measure. Before you go about your day, I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude for tuning in. Your interest and engagement are what keep Restless Killers and Mysteries with Roger Heilig alive and well. Remember, if today's program piqued your interest, why not further your grasp of a completely different enigma? Our program is sponsored by AM's Beyond the Grassy Knoll, How JFK's Death Changed American Society Forever. Wolf? It's available on Amazon and Audible, so you can listen in while cuddled up with a book or on the move with your headphones. It's a compelling read, or listen that peels back the layers of one of America's most contentious moments. Now I'm sure you're wanting to know what's next on our ghoulish menu. You won't want to miss our forthcoming episode, which delves into the creepy story of the Zodiac Killer, another enigmatic and shadowy individual who remains unidentified to this day. Who is behind the enigmatic ciphers and mystery murders? We'll comb through the evidence and theories to come closer to the truth behind this infamous case. Until then, stay curious, safe, and never stop asking questions. If you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. Every piece of assistance you provide helps us solve more of the mysteries that stalk our world. This is Roger Heilig signing off. Catch you on the other side, my restless sleuths.